and as well, Richard.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all again.
Thanks, Richard. Um, okay, so colleagues, we are looking at BT Odell 1 site, and I'm sure by now you all are familiar with how to actually find the site and link up with the site. So today we will look at study unit 3. So remember, we looked at in the past 2 weeks, we looked at the role of the e-tutors in an Odell environment. We looked at the different pedagogies that are used in an Odell environment. And today, more specifically, we're going to look at the social and experiential learning in an Odell environment. Now, the idea of looking at the social elements of, okay, so colleagues, just remember, just a reminder that your mics and cameras are mute for the duration of the presentation. Once we complete the presentation, we will then open up the mics for questions, but you are also free to post your comments and your questions in the chat itself. Okay, so colleagues, this week we're looking at designing social and experiential learning for an online environment. Now, remember, when we talk about social learning, one of the important things for us to understand is that all our learners are social beings. Even in a distance education environment, there's a longing to be part of a social network. For example, if our students are learning individually, they engage with each other in an online environment, and that means that they are forming part of a social group. Now, we want to nurture that. One of the biggest challenges with being in a distance education environment is the distance. And we want to mediate that distance by creating an ideal space for learners to engage and be social beings as part of the learning process. Now, remember in our unit from last week, if you recap, we spoke about social constructivist approach, the social constructivist approach to pedagogy, which being the foundation of the entire tutoring model at UNISA. Now, by the end of this study unit, when we talk about designing social learning experiences, we want you to look at what are the principles for an embodied social learning environment. What do we mean by an embodied learner approach? Specifically, how this impacts the online learning environment. We also want to see that you can design or have an idea of the principles of designing online spaces using the universal design principles. We also want to look at how you think of designing online activities, collective student groups, but more specifically, how you also design or think of online interaction and monitoring of online behavior. Now, remember, that is important for you as an e-tutor. You will look at how to engage and monitor, and we will do part of this next week when we look at the stats, the statistic tools. And then we will also look at what are lurkers and active participation. Now, the concept of lurkers and active participation is very important, and we will discuss this as part of this unit. So the required readings, we've got a few readings that are very important for you. So we've got the first reading that focuses on social learning, web-based environments. We've got the second reading by Professor Moketsi Letseka, which looks at the notion of Ubuntu in an online environment. And then we look at how to design, what are the universal design principles in specific in terms of designing online tutoring sites. We look at an article again by Terry Anderson, and on how communities of inquiry are formed in online environments. Now, remember, communities of inquiry means students form part of a network. And then we also look at Anderson and Dron's learning technologies through the 3 generations. Now, you would have recalled in the previous units, we've looked at the idea of 3 generations of pedagogy. In this, we look at what are the 3 generations of technology matching those pedagogy. And then we look at the last article, which focuses on some key insights into online participation and lurkers. Now, firstly, we know that, as I said, that we all function as part of a social network. We also know that in a social network, we, like, for example, Facebook, Twitter, it all forms part of us engaging with each other in an online space. And if we look at some of these social networks like Facebook and Twitter, it has become part of our life. It's not a secondary. For many people, it is integrated into their daily life. And this means that even while we are human beings functioning in a physical space, we are also looking for an online social experience, a virtual social experience as part of our engagements, daily engagements. So social learning in open distance learning, what does that mean for us? And the social learning theory was developed by Albert Bandura, and he explained social learning as learning would be exceedingly laborious, meaning tiring, not to mention hazardous, if people relied solely on their own actions to inform what they do. So is the idea is behind the social learning theory is that we look and we model behaviors of others as part of our learning experience. Now, if you think of this in a social learning context, a virtual environment, you'll find that even on spaces such as Facebook, such as Twitter, you find that modeling of behavior exists in those spaces as well. And when we talk modeling of behavior, it means that students look at how other students behave in these online spaces. They follow what other students are engaging as part of their learning process. And this becomes what we call the modeling of online behavior, which it looks at both the social cognition, the learning, and the modeling elements. And in this, you can actually find a very interesting video by Albert Bandura, where he provides an introduction to his concept of social learning, right? So I would actually encourage you to actually watch that video. Now, when we talk of social learning, there are three important characteristics, or what we call constructs of social learning, right? So the first one we look at is the learner characteristics. Now, when we talk of learner characteristics, we talk about the learner him or herself, right? Secondly, we talk about the context in which learning takes place. And the third element is culture and community. Culture, remember, the culture is not just culture of the individual, but also culture of an organization, community of the organization as well. But it also means that the individual student that comes into these virtual spaces are not coming in isolation from their own culture or their own community. They bring those ideals as part of the learning process, right? And that's what actually characterizes them, makes them social learning beings. Now, context means, in this context, is when we talk context, we need to understand context from the following: interactions, group and class size, and resources. Now, interactions imply that knowledge is constructed while students engage in activities. And this is why, for us, the idea of youth designing activities, discussion forums is so critical, because when students interact on those discussion forums, they start constructing their knowledge, they start learning from their engagements. And also when you provide feedback to those engagements. So, for example, if you are designing discussion forums, you are asking your students to engage in these discussion forums. But in addition to that, as a tutor, you would also be providing feedback to your students on these discussion forums. So it doesn't mean that you simply say, go to this discussion forum and post or discuss what this concept means without providing feedback as an e-tutor. And this is why it's critical, because in that context, learning is taking place through the actions that you are providing. The third element is resources, which means that as an e-tutor, you are going to provide resources to your students. In some cases, in some instances, the resources are already provided by the academics and they restrict the resources. In some instances, the academics may ask you to provide some resources as well. And those resources, remember, are not resources as in content, but designing learning experiences around the content, right? So that's important that you understand that distinction. Now, the second one is on culture and community. Now, when we talk of culture and community, we talk about context, right? And in culture and community, for example, in Africa, we talk about diverse social composition, different cultures, different races. In addition to different races, different cultures, we also talk about the gender disparities that exist in these spaces. And what that means is that when you talk about the notion of community, you have to be conscious of these elements as part of your tutoring space. So, for example, we cannot ignore the fact that in our group, we may have large numbers of females, which is literally the statistics at UNISA, that we have more females as part of our student cohort as opposed to male students. Now, what does that mean for us from a perspective of statistics? Now, let me share some of the insights that we've actually observed from our statistics. Firstly, knowing that UNISA has a large female composition, it means we have more females in our classes, right? And you will have more females in your own tutoring groups, which means that you need to create spaces for those voices to actually come to the fore. Secondly, we know that in some communities, looking at the digital divide, it's mostly females that in the rural areas that actually suffered from the digital divide. So what does that mean when we are engaging with students in a community of practice, a community of learners? It means we need to be conscious of these other factors that affects the learning experiences of our students. And sometimes we simply don't take that for granted. We take the fact that all our students are equal, all our students understand technology, and they can simply function in these spaces. But our statistics and our observations shows us that these are the gaps that are realistic in our own context, and we cannot ignore the contextual factors that defines our tutoring experiences in these spaces, which means that as an e-tutor, you need to be aware of these different factors that comes into play. And this is why we stress that thinking of the context, the culture and the community from where our students come to space, the gender disparities, the ethnicity, the race, belief systems, etc., are core to understanding and creating the ideal experiences for our students as part of this. So for example, some may have their own perceptions on gender issues, but we need to create an understanding that these are neutral spaces for our students. So it means that as an e-tutor, we're not saying you not to have your own perceptions, but be cognizant of the fact that in these spaces we need to respect other people's opinions, cultures, and belief systems as part of this approach as well. And that's very important. Maybe I should actually give this example. In one of our previous groups, we had an e-tutor, similar kind of training like this, and we had an e-tutor who posted very defamatory comments on gender, right? And he thought it was quite humorous, where he posted some kind of discussions on our WhatsApp groups on experiences with his girlfriend, and thinking that he was joking. However, when he did this as part of the group, immediately many of the females in the group found this very oppressive, and we actually had to excommunicate him from the group. And he may have completed the course, but we did not employ him as part of the tutoring group. And the reason behind that is we need to respect each other as part of the group, and if we cannot respect each other as part of a tutoring community of practice, there is no way that we will in good conscience release such tutors to then go and tutor our students, knowing that this type of behavior is prevalent. So this becomes quite critical for us to also understand that how we perceive and how we engage with our students and amongst yourselves also then transfers to these online spaces as part of how our students perceive us. So that's very important. Then it also means that we need to think of motivation, individual learning styles, epistemological beliefs. Now, this is just making you aware that the dynamics of being in an online space is much more complex than just being a tutor and posting up comments. We need to be very conscious of how we engage in these spaces, how we phrase our discussion. We need to ensure that we're inclusive in the languages that we use as part of our tutoring spaces. And that's very important. Okay, then the idea of thinking of Ubuntu in an online learning environment. Now here, colleagues, Professor Muketsi Letseka, who holds the ODEL, the UNESCO ODL chair at UNESCO, wrote an interesting article on how Ubuntu functions in an online environment. And his idea was that, the basic notion or basic philosophy and principle of Ubuntu is a human being because of others. Right, so you're not in isolation. You are part of this. Your identity as a human being is also in relation to others. And his idea that even in an online space, such as distance education, the idea of humanness, personhood, and morality forms part of the integrated approach to how we see our students. Now, these may be for some of you, these may be just, okay, these are simple stuff that you should take for granted, that you should know. But sometimes it's important for us to affirm these ideals, because this is what UNISA affirms, of us understanding that our students are part of a community of practice, respecting our students in these spaces. And that respect means that if we respect our students in these spaces, students will reverse that respect back to us as part of the teaching staff, which you are part of the teaching support staff, right? So he has an interesting view on how Ubuntu provides the democratic educational space, and how it talks about diversity, tolerance, difference, understanding difference, and how that becomes quite critical in the teaching space. And in this article, we basically adapt those principles and say that those principles are also applicable to you in your tutoring space. Because as I said earlier, while you may be categorized as student support, you are inevitably part of the teaching cohort at UNISA, because you provide a level of student support, tutoring that actually engages with students face-to-face, inverted commas, because it's done virtually, but engages with the students on a frequent basis, but also directly with the content. So that means that as part of this, we need to understand how we we maintain that humanness of our students in these spaces, respect them as part of this process. And that means that if we create those type of engagements with our student, it will revert back to us and having that same kind of engagements. And this article is actually fascinating. I know Prof. Letseka Moketsi personally, and we've actually engaged with him on several other issues as well. And he's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant intellectual. So please read that article, right? And then applying universal design principles. So UNISA as a unit called the Advocacy for Students that are Disabled or Differently Enabled, more accurately. And everything that we do foregrounds the idea that we think of our students that are differently enabled as part of our community of students and not seen as different cohort of our students. Now, let me say this, and I think I mentioned this the last time as well. At UNISA, we don't force students to disclose their disability. So students have the freedom to disclose their disability. In many cases, when it comes to assessments, especially exams, we ask students to contact the unit responsible for students that are differently enabled and provide them information of what their disability is so that they can be assisted through, for example, in assessments, having extra time or devices that they may need or whatever service that they may need. So we encourage that. But at the same time, we do not force our students to disclose their disabilities, which means that you may have a student that is differently enabled as part of your tutoring group, and you may not necessarily know that. So what does that mean for you as an e-tutor? It means simply that we need to be conscious of the fact that if we had a student that is differently enabled, are we creating an environment which is inclusive for that student? So for example, this morning we did a student workshop, a student training webinar on helping our students with the new upgraded My UNISA. So for those of you that know, UNISA is now upgraded from Sakai to Moodle. It has more features as part of it. And in order for us to be inclusive as part of our tutoring, as part of our training webinar, we included a sign language interpreter as part of this, right? So now it meant that our webinars has a dimension of being inclusive to these students. It's not the only dimension, there are other elements as well. Now, obviously, we are not asking you to have the skill of sign language and start using that. But what we mean is in the small gestures that you are doing, the elements that you are working with in your own courses. For example, when you are designing a video, for example, and integrating a self video that you are producing yourself, what it means is that you should have the transcript of the video as part of this, right? In some cases, if you are really advanced enough with editing and you have that skill, and not everybody has that skill, you could actually put in subtitles or captions as part of your video as well. Now, we're not asking you to go through that extreme length, but what we are saying is that if you are putting videos up, try to ensure that it has transcripts. So for example, YouTube has the function available to have transcripts. Find a video, if you find a video on YouTube, make sure that that video that you are using, that you can enable transcript to ensure that it's inclusive. So it shows from a tutor perspective that you are really going that extension to be inclusive in your design. Okay, so some of the universal design principles that you engage, universal design for learning, universal design for instruction, and universal instructional design. All three dimensions are critical that you understand the distinctions and you understand what this means. Now, in some places, for example, if you look at some of the principles of UDI, flexibility in use, simple, intuitive, tolerance for error, etc., these are core principles that you will then look at as part of this document, that the part of this article that you look at in universal design principles, right? So look at that document, colleagues. And I also added a universal instructional design document produced by University of Guelph, and that actually gives you some guidelines to how how some of the principles could be applied. Now, remember, in your portfolio, we ask you to design activities, but in your portfolio, we also ask you to demonstrate how you apply the universal design principle. So be cognizant that when you are engaging with the study unit, that you will be asking your portfolio to apply some of these concepts, or demonstrate some of these concepts, right? Now, the evolution of a community of inquiry, drawing from Anderson's article, and here he talks about the idea of teaching presence, social presence, learning presence, and cognitive presence. Now, his idea here is that these four dimensions occurs as part of a learning approach When we talk of a community of inquiry or a community of inquiry framework, these are the different notions of what we call presence that appear in this model, right? And it's quite important because the teaching presence, learner presence, and social presence, and cognitive presence means that there are different levels of how we engage our tutors in this part, students in part of this engagement, right? So social presence is the ability of participants to identify with the community, for example, the cause of study, communicate in a trusting environment, develop interpersonal relations between their fellow peers and also with you as a tutor. Teaching presence is the design, facilitation, direction of cognitive and social processes for the purpose of realizing educational, worthwhile learning outcomes, etc. And cognitive is the extent which learners are able to construct and confirm meaning through their reflection and discourse of whatever content is going on. So these ideas, they're social, cognitive, teaching, it all culminates with what Anderson and John calls about the educational experience that we give to our students, right? And here, what you look at now is from this points of from a specific article, is where we start to unpack what is teaching presence, for example. Now, think of teaching presence, think of tutoring presence. The instructor, in your case, each tutor clearly communicates important course topics, important course goals, those type of elements. Social presence is getting to know the other course participants. And remember, last week we spoke about designing activities, and we said one of the very first activity should be introduce yourself, tell the participant introduce themselves to each other. Using Gilly Salmon's model. Now, what that does is that you get to know, now if you look at this social presence, is you're getting to know the other participants. You're getting to know who's in your group. You're getting to know who's in your specific each tutoring group and how you can engage with them. So this is important. And cognitive presence is the idea of the skills that are explored in problem solving, brainstorming, mapping, etc. Right? And here we are actually, how can the COI model, the community inquiry model, be integrated into tutoring space, and we provide you some articles or some videos that you can actually engage with, right? Then learning analytics, we talk about learning analytics, personalized learning and adaptive assessment. Now, learning analytics is quite important. We don't touch too much on learning analytics at this point. We only want you to get an introduction that there is something called learning analytics that's part of the MyUnisa environment. And I think the statistic part, my colleague Richard will demonstrate that next week when he runs through some of the elements of Moodle with you as part of your training. So you will see that there are plenty of learning analytics, but what we use learning analytics for is to understand how a student behaviors, how much of time they spend on a specific activity, how much of time during the week they log on. Those learning analytics actually helps us to understand our students' behavior. Okay, then the learning technologies through the different generations. We talk about the different, for example, cognitive behaviorists, the social constructivists, and we talk about the different technologies that are used as part of these approaches. In some cases, it talks about, for example, the idea of discussion forums, blogs, etc., that are tools that we use part of this learning experience. And Richard would actually demonstrate next week in his session, specifically focusing on the digital tools, some of the functions that forms part of these different pedagogical approaches. And I think in one of his questions in the portfolio, he actually asks you to, or one of his assessment questions in the assignments, he actually asks you to demonstrate some of these technology functions as part of the assignment that you will submit. Then for those of you who are from the education environment, you should be very, very familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. And Bloom's taxonomy, colleagues, basically in a nutshell, helps us to think about the different levels, cognitive levels that we engage with our students. So, for example, in the traditional Bloom's taxonomy, the old Bloom's taxonomy was evaluation, synthesis, analysis, application, comprehension, knowledge. And then in the revised Bloom's taxonomy that fits for the digital age, we talk about remembering, understand, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating knowledge. Now, if you look at that very clearly, you should find some similarity going back to Gilly Salmon's model when she spoke about the different levels of discussions that we create or activities that we create. And a final activity at the last stage was creating knowledge. And you can see how that very comfortably fits within Bloom's taxonomy of the revised version for digital era. Then colleagues are developing a set of guidelines for student online participation in tutoring spaces. This is very important, colleagues, and I can stress this. Remember, UNISA is a complex environment, which means that, as I said earlier, you have students that are diverse students. And it has become we've become very aware of it as previously, that in some cases, students share, for example, their WhatsApp numbers, etc., as part of the discussion forums to take students off the portal, which seems to be the trend across, which we discourage. We prefer our students to work on the UNISA portal. We do not recognize WhatsApp groups. We do not recognize Telegram as any official UNISA portal. So anything that's done on those spaces are not official UNISA spaces. And you as an e-tutor should not engage with those spaces for two reasons. One, it goes against the POPI Act of the privacy of personal information. And also, secondly, is those spaces are not monitored. So it means, for example, if something happens in those spaces, we do not monitor at an institution, and you could be in a critical position if something happens on those spaces and you as an e-tutor have used those as official spaces for tutoring with your students. So we discourage any social media spaces that are outside of the UNISA's official learning management system. Because once you perform or tutor on the platform, we can monitor it. And remember, when you monitor it, you get paid for the work that you're doing. If you say that you've done work on these offline spaces and we cannot monitor it, that means we don't have evidence and you will not get paid for the work that you've done. So in these spaces, what I suggest that you do is also look at what we call the netiquette for online interaction in the tutoring space. Now, netiquette basically means a set of guidelines, and this is very important because if you have a set of guidelines, now we're not talking about complex guidelines to say according to this law or legislation, you need to do 1, 2, 3, whatever it is. We're saying simple guidelines, right? That students can immediately read and understand. So, for example, don't post memes on the discussion forum. Don't use this discussion forum as a dating site and passing phone numbers out. Now, it may sound ridiculous, but believe me, these are things that actually happens in reality on UNISA platforms, right? So that guidelines actually helps you. So develop some of these guidelines, and we've given you some of these sites that you look at other universities, and these are universities where we found that these guidelines are actually quite simple. 10 rules for netiquette, for example, 10 simple rules that are applicable and actually gives you that safe space that you can work with, right? And then the last one, active participation and lurkers. Now, the distinction between active participant and lurkers. Remember, these are two types of students that we found at UNISA. Active participants means that participants that are logging in every day, participating very frequently on your discussion forums, on your tutoring groups. And there's evidence to support that these are really functional digital learning students, right? And then we have, and this normally is a group of students who dominate, most of the time, at least a group of students that actually dominate a lot of the discussions, dominate some of the interactions between the lecturer, and you as an e-tutor, you will see those trends emerging very, very fast. But then there's also the second category, which we call lurkers. And when we looked at the My UNISA stats, we found that while there may be 20% of the class that is performing at the level that you want, 60% may also be logging into the site, reading the post, but not necessarily participating in it. And these are what we call lurkers. And this becomes an emerging dominant theme, especially during exam time. Now, what does this mean? It means we don't discourage lurkers because we still want them to get onto the site. We still want them to actually read the discussion. We still want them to follow what's happening. But somewhere along the line, you need to try to get those people who are lurkers, just watching what everybody else is doing, to start participating in those discussions. Now, obviously, we don't expect you to perform a miracle on your own, but we know that there are a lot of tutors that have actually used this space and created good cultures of online participation, right? And we've also asked academics now to also help you as e-tutors. So you'll find going forward that some of, for example, some of your learning activities are already designed as part of their courses. And in some cases, there are some colleges where you will not be working on separate tutor sites, but you'll be working on the actual master sites with the academics as well. So there are different models that are being used at UNISA. And when you are appointed and you start meeting with your academics in your different colleges, you will come to know the different models of interaction with the students, right? Now, for example, as I mentioned, you have what we call individual learning, the individual tutor sites, where you will have your own site as an e-tutor and you will have your own group of 200 or 250 students allocated to you. But in some colleges, for example, CHEMS, College of Economic and Management Sciences, they use some lecturers use a model called the hybrid model. So they have their tutors functioning on the actual primary lecturer site with all the students. That means if they have 5,000 students, all 5,000 students on the primary site, and they will then have a schedule where they will tell you, as an e-tutor, you come on this day at tutor. Now, these are different models, and as you pass this generic training and you start getting inducted by your academics in the actual department and college, you will find that you will be made, these models will be made better known to you. But what does it mean for you as an e-tutor? In the back of your mind, to understand that these two categories of students are what exist in these spaces, lurkers and active participants. But as an e-tutor, your goal, whether it's in a hybrid model or your individual site, is to get as many students as possible participating in these spaces. If they participate together, they will engage and learn as part of the community of inquiry, right? Then, colleagues, your assignment question. Now, as part of this assignment, it's very simple. All we ask you to do is write an essay in which you discuss the importance of social learning in ODEL environment, and your essay should focus on the following aspects. What do you understand by the term social learning? What do you think? Why do you think it's important to consider learners as social beings in an ODEL environment? And the last one, as typically as the other assignments, what are some of the basic principles that you will apply or employ to create an ideal social learning environment for your students? So literally everything that I just said to you now in this last conversation is your third bullet, right? So if you can recap very creatively what I just gave you in the last part of that I've just discussed, of how we created awareness, bring the students out, active participation, that's actually your response to your last bullet, right? I give you the word, the amount, how many points, etc. And these are similar kind of guidelines that I've given you for the other assignments as well. So colleagues, this is a very study unit 3, and we only have one more study unit next week. Next week is our last week, the 4th week of our bootcamp, and next week Richard will be discussing the digital tools, and that's very critical because we will actually be discussing the tools on the new LMS, MyUnisa, the upgraded MyUnisa. So this time, let me stop and hand over Richard. Richard will walk you through the questions. Richard?
Okay, Denzel. Just before we start, this week we had a problem as well with students unable to upload their assignments to the forum. If you experience this problem, just let us know as soon as possible, and so because then we send it through to ICT. So it does seem there is a space issue at the moment, but it is up and working at the moment. So if you were struggling, please just try again and to upload your assignments to the forum. So we can open up with the chat. Please raise your hand if you've got a question. That we'll start with the first hand that's raised. Let me just quickly allow the mic for all attendees. So you should be able to unmute at the moment. And then, as Denzel mentioned, next week we will look at Unit 4. That at the moment, the Unit 4 is written to how can I say, accommodate for both learning platforms, the Kai and Moodle. But going forward, we will just focus on Moodle, as that is the new learning management system now implemented for UNISA, and that is the learning management system that you will be using going forward. But if you're going to be viewing the study unit during the week, remember it is still the same tools that you will be used, the same concept behind the tools. So the content, the information on the study unit is still very, very relevant to for the assignment. So you can still complete the assignment by just completing the study unit. I'm not seeing any hands. Is there any questions from you? Okay, we've got one from Dicky Lady. You can go ahead.
Evening and everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. I actually have a question in terms of the due date for submission. You mentioned that next week Tuesday is our last day of the workshop. So I was just wondering when is our last date for submission? Thank you.
Okay, so the last date of submission is the 15th. So you should already now have, how can I say, finish up assignment 3 as quickly as possible. Do assignment 4 as well, so that you'll that last 3 days that you can really just spend on your portfolio. So remember, your portfolio also, you know, relates to all the study units. So you can start already with your portfolio as well. That's in study unit 6. But the 18th is the final submission day. Then we've got Kona, guest. You go ahead.
Evening, everyone. So I just want to know about how many assignments are we doing? Assessment.
Okay, so remember there is 4 assignments. So study unit 1, study unit 2, 3 and 4. If you scroll all the way to the end of the study unit, there's where you will find the guide for how to do the assignment and how to submit the assignment. And then study unit 6 contains the big portfolio that you also need to complete.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Any other questions? I just want to see there's a question in the chat. Lamini, Shireen, just send us an email to tdp@unisa.ac.za so we can just make sure whether your marks has been included with the batch that's already been sent through or whether there is still outstanding that we need to submit for the next submission. So if you have submitted all your assignments already and your portfolio and it has been marked, then it would have been sent to colleges already to continue with the contracting process. So remember, contracting process, we don't have direct contact with them, but the process is currently underway and there is already e-tutors that receive their contracts. But so the colleges do work independently, so it might be delayed for some of the colleges. I'll quickly give you the email address in the chat. Already put it there for us. Thanks, Denzel. Okay, we've got another hand here. Sunny, you can go ahead.
Good evening, Richard. My apologies, I couldn't hear you clearly when you were talking about the submission date. I had a connection challenge there. I just want to confirm the submission date again. I couldn't hear it clearly. Over to you. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, so the submission date is the 18th of February. So that will be, I think, next Friday. Yes.
Noted. Thank you so much.
Okay. So remember, that's the due date for all the assignments and the portfolio. So we can mark it as quickly as possible to give your marks through to the colleges for contracting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional questions? Tisetsu, you can go ahead.
Hi, Richard. I just wanted to find out, in any case where, let's say, a student has difficulties with connectivity, what's the suggested way forward? Let's say they miss the tutoring session or they can't connect at all. What do we do in that case?
Okay, so remember, when you do a tutoring session, for instance, online, you're doing a video conference or using one of the video abilities that's there. So usually you will make a recording of it to make it available to students afterwards, because all students also can't be in a particular time slot. So usually you will open, if there was a discussion even just between you and a couple of students, you will generally keep it open to all the students so that they can still access it afterwards. As Denzel also now mentioned in the, when he went through the study unit, that concept of lurkers, and you will actually get a lot of students that won't interact necessarily with you, even with a live session. And that's why it's so important to actually continue with your lessons, because even if they don't interact with you directly, they are actually still there in the background. And they actually learn quite a lot from what other students ask and even just still what you present to them. Now, that's where we then look at statistics and reports and usage reports. because you might do an activity online and you might feel, oh, but there's nobody there. But then you go look at the statistics and there was actually a lot of them there, but they just didn't interact with you directly. So you might think there's one student. So really encourages students that is very active on the site, because the others also really benefit from that interaction. I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Yes, you do. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry for the music here at the background. They're having a couples evening here at the hotel where I'm staying. Any additional questions?
Richard, maybe we should say that you're not staying in the hotel because your wife kicked you out. You're staying in the hotel because you're attending a conference yourself.
Yes. Okay, guys, so see there's no more questions. So really, if you have any questions, getting stuck anywhere, really contact us on tdp@unisa.ac.za. We really try and answer you as quick as possible, especially if you're having submission problems, so that we can even, if you're really struggling from your side, even do it from our side, because it's very important to submit on the site, because that's in the end where we go to actually download. It's very hard to manage the email submissions with the site submissions, because on the site we actually can draw down exactly who submitted and when you submitted. So if you have any problems with submitting online, just let us know, but it's very important to rather not email us the assignments, but rather submit it on the course site. Denzel, anything from your side?
Nothing, Richard. I think we can conclude. Thanks, Richard. I think there's one more and then we can conclude.
Okay, there's one minute. Let me just see. Rafina, you can go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to understand that like myself, I'm still busy with the assignment, and sometimes I want to ask a question, like I've forwarded you an email during the week and there was no response, and I wonder if you can maybe give us your contact so that we can maybe just make a call and ask and then continue working.
Okay, I'll give you my contact as well in the chat. It was probably just an oversight this week because we're doing student inductions as well, but
Okay.
we will definitely get back to you. But I'll give you my direct email as well. I'm trying to really keep up to date so that you can all be ready for the 18th. So you can always send it to me there as well in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeffnia.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you everyone. So good luck with your assignments, and definitely check in next week when we introduce to you study unit 4. But we will also have a look at the new Moodle implementation. We are later also going to take you, if you get contracted, take you again through specifics to the Moodle, more, how can I say, hands-on approach. But next week we'll definitely give you an overview so you understand the concepts. So when you get your contracted, you can start right away. So really have a good evening, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues. Cheers.
Hey.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Mm-hmm.